I was a nurse they blamed for missing meds, and in that moment when Administrator Carson's cold eyes fixed on me across the sterile conference room table, I felt my 15-year career dissolving like salt in an open wound. The accusation hung in the air like antiseptic fumes. Carson's fingers drummed against the manila folder containing what I assumed was my termination paperwork, while Dr. Mitchell sat beside him with the practiced look of wounded disappointment that had fooled everyone for years. The morning light streaming through the hospital's tinted windows cast everything in that sickly green hue that made even healthy people look like corpses. Carson's mouth moved in measured syllables, each word carefully chosen to slice deeper than the last. Controlled substances, missing inventory, my access codes, my shifts. The numbers didn't lie, apparently, even when everything else in that room did. I kept my hands flat on the table, feeling the cheap laminate grain beneath my palms. My nursing badge, Sarah Chen, RN BSN, caught the light like a small mirror reflecting back years of double shifts, missed holidays, and patients who trusted me with their lives. None of that mattered now. The spreadsheet Carson slid toward me showed the damning pattern: morphine, oxycodone, fentanyl patches. All missing during my rotations in the oncology ward. Doctor, Mitchell shifted in his chair, and I caught the subtle shake of his head when Carson glanced his way. Such a convincing performance of reluctant betrayal. His surgical scrubs were pristine, as always, not a wrinkle or stain to suggest he'd spent any time actually treating patients instead of pillaging their pain relief. The weight of their combined stare pressed down on my shoulders like lead blankets during x-rays. Carson's pen clicked once, twice, 3 times, a metronome counting down to my professional execution. The hospital's white noise hummed around us, distant monitors beeping, ventilation systems cycling, the occasional code blue announcement that would no longer concern me. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez in room 314, how she'd gripped my hand last week while tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. The morphine pump wasn't working. She'd gestured frantically, the pain eating through her bones like acid. When I'd checked the medication levels, the discrepancy was there again. Less than what should have been administered, less than what her agony demanded. That's when the pattern had started forming in my mind, a constellation of missing doses and suffering patients that spelled out a truth nobody wanted to see. But I'd been too focused on patient care, too trusting of the system, too naive to realize I was being positioned as the perfect scapegoat. Carson finally stopped clicking his pen and reached for the folder. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed unnaturally loud. My employment contract probably, along with whatever legal waivers they'd need me to sign to avoid a lawsuit. The hospital's lawyers had likely spent more time crafting my downfall than I'd spent building my career. Doctor? Mitchell leaned back in his chair, arms crossed in a posture I'd seen him use during department meetings when discussing budget cuts. Always the concerned colleague, always the voice of reason wrapped in a white coat and moral authority. His prescription pad stuck out slightly from his breast pocket, and I found myself wondering how many legitimate scripts he'd written versus how many had been diverted. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Carson's expectant expression suggested he was waiting for something, a confession perhaps, or maybe just the satisfaction of watching me break down. But I'd spent too many years holding steady during medical emergencies to crumble now, even as my world imploded around me. Instead, I memorized every detail of this moment. The way Carson's tie clip caught the fluorescent light, the slight tremor in Dr. Mitchell's left hand that he tried to hide by gripping his coffee cup, the institutional smell of bleach and desperation that permeated every surface in this place. All of it would matter later, when the tables turned and the truth finally surfaced. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably my sister wondering if I'd be able to make it to dinner Sunday, not knowing that by then I'd be unemployed and possibly facing criminal charges. The normal world continuing its rotation while mine stopped spinning entirely. Carson cleared his throat, a sound like grinding coffee beans, and began laying out the terms of my departure. Immediate termination. Security escort to clean out my locker. No references. A letter of reprimand that would follow me to every potential employer in the medical field. Professional suicide executed with bureaucratic precision. But as I sat there absorbing the full scope of their betrayal, something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest. Not panic, not despair, calculation. Because in that moment of absolute loss, I realized something they'd overlooked in their careful planning. I knew this hospital better than anyone, knew its rhythms and blind spots, knew where bodies were buried and secrets were kept. And I knew something else they didn't realize I knew. 3 weeks earlier, during one of my night shifts, I'd been restocking the medication cart when I'd noticed Dr. Mitchell's unusual presence in the supply room. Nothing suspicious on the surface. Doctors accessed medications all the time. But it was 2:47 a.m., and his patients were all stable, sleeping off their surgeries or lost in pharmaceutical dreams. I'd continued my inventory, moving quietly between the rows of locked cabinets, when I'd heard the distinct sound of a keypad being pressed. Not once, but repeatedly, as if someone was trying different combinations. The medication dispensing system kept logs of every access, every withdrawal, every dose administered. But those logs could be altered if you knew the right codes, had the right clearance levels. Dr. Mitchell had emerged from behind the cardiac medication section with a small vial palmed in his hand. A move so practiced it was almost invisible. Almost. But I'd spent years watching for the tiny details that could mean life or death for my patients, and that sleight of hand registered like a scream in the quiet supply room. Now, sitting across from Carson's satisfied smile and Mitchell's performance of reluctant duty, I understood the full architecture of their scheme. The missing medications weren't disappearing randomly. They were being systematically harvested, probably for street sale or personal use. And I, with my perfect attendance record and keycard access, made the ideal cover story. Carson was still talking, outlining the investigation process and the potential criminal charges that might follow. His words washed over me like background noise while I traced the threads of their conspiracy. How long had this been going on? How many patients had suffered while their pain medication was diverted into Mitchell's pockets? How many other staff members might have been sacrificed to protect this profitable little side business? The mathematics of revenge began calculating themselves in my mind. Evidence needed, patterns documented, proof gathered, and most importantly, timing orchestrated to cause maximum damage to the people who'd orchestrated mine. I thought about the security cameras positioned throughout the hospital, their blind spots and coverage areas, about the medication logs that could be retrieved from backup servers, about the patient complaints that might reveal a pattern of inadequate pain management, about the financial records that might show Mitchell's suddenly improved lifestyle despite his modest hospital salary. Carson slid a document across the table, my resignation letter, already typed and waiting for my signature. The ultimate insult, forcing me to participate in my own professional execution. Dr. Mitchell's eyes met mine briefly over the paper, and I saw something flicker there. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of nervous satisfaction. The look of someone who'd pulled off a complex heist and was savoring the moment of apparent victory. But I'd learned something important in 15 years of nursing. Apparent victories often preceded spectacular failures. Patients who seemed stable could crash without warning. Systems that appeared foolproof could reveal fatal flaws. And people who thought they'd covered their tracks perfectly usually left breadcrumbs everywhere. I picked up Carson's pen, the same one he'd been clicking like a countdown timer, and felt its weight in my fingers. A simple Bic ballpoint, probably worth less than $1, but in that moment it felt like a scalpel. Precise, sharp, capable of making clean cuts when applied with the right pressure. My signature flowed across the resignation letter in smooth, practiced strokes. The same handwriting that had documented thousands of patient interactions, medication administrations, and shift reports. The same penmanship that would soon be documenting something entirely different. Carson's smile widened as I set the pen down. Mission accomplished, apparently. Another potential problem solved through institutional power and careful scapegoating. He probably went home that night feeling satisfied with a job well done, never realizing he'd just signed his own warrant. Dr. Mitchell stood first, smoothing his scrubs with hands that should have been trembling but weren't. Such confidence, such certainty that his little empire was secure. He nodded once to Carson, some prearranged signal that the execution had been successful, and headed for the door. But I was already 3 steps ahead, mentally mapping out the investigation I'd conduct from the outside. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The security guard who escorted me to my locker was Tommy Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, as it happened, the same woman whose pain had been inadequately managed by Mitchell's medication thefts. Tommy's expression was professionally neutral, but I caught the way his jaw tightened when we passed the oncology ward. My locker had been pathetically easy to pack. 15 years reduced to a cardboard box, a few personal photos, some medical references, a coffee mug my sister had given me, the detritus of a career that had defined my identity since nursing school. But as I cleared out the last of my belongings, I made sure to palm something Carson and Mitchell didn't know I had: a backup drive containing 3 months of shift reports, medication discrepancy logs, and patient complaint summaries. Information they assumed would disappear with my termination. Data they never thought a nurse would be smart enough to preserve. Evidence that would soon become the foundation of their destruction. Tommy walked me to the parking garage in silence, but as we reached my car, he cleared his throat and looked around to make sure we were alone. His next words weren't officially sanctioned, weren't part of his security protocol, but they confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. I wasn't the first person to notice the medication irregularities. His grandmother, he explained through careful gestures and meaningful glances, had been asking questions about her pain management. Other families had been complaining too, wondering why their loved ones seemed to suffer more than expected. The pattern was there for anyone willing to look, but hospital administration had been remarkably uninterested in investigating their star surgeon. As I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, past the sleeping houses of people who still trusted that hospitals were places of healing rather than exploitation, I began to understand the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just about stolen medications or falsified records. This was about a system that protected its profitable members at the expense of everyone else: patients, nurses, families, anyone without enough power to fight back. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed I'd go quietly, disappear into professional obscurity, maybe find work at some small clinic where my damaged reputation wouldn't matter. They'd assumed wrong. The next morning, I began my real work. My first stop was the State Board of Nursing, where I filed a formal complaint including every detail I could remember about the medication discrepancies. The clerk who took my statement was sympathetic, but warned me that investigations could take months, especially when they involved accusations against prominent physicians. Months I might not have before Mitchell found a new scapegoat or refined his operation. From there, I drove to the county prosecutor's office and requested a meeting with someone from their white-collar crime division. The detective who eventually agreed to see me was skeptical at first. A disgruntled ex-employee making accusations against her former boss wasn't exactly unusual. But when I presented my preliminary evidence, including the backup drive and documented patient complaints, his interest sharpened considerably. Detective Morrison was a thin man with tired eyes who'd clearly seen every variety of human corruption the city had to offer. But something about my case seemed to energize him, probably because healthcare fraud hit close to home for someone who'd likely had to trust hospitals with his own family's lives. He agreed to open a preliminary investigation, though he warned me that building a solid case would require more than circumstantial evidence and suspicious patterns. I needed proof. Incontrovertible documentation that would survive legal challenges and administrative cover-ups. Evidence that would destroy not just Mitchell's career, but the entire network that had enabled his theft and protected him from consequences. That's when I realized my termination might have been the best thing that could have happened to me. Because now I was free to pursue justice without worrying about workplace politics or professional relationships. I was unemployed, angry, and equipped with 15 years of insider knowledge about how hospitals really operated. I spent the rest of that week conducting surveillance from my car in the hospital parking garage, documenting Mitchell's unusual hours and patterns. He arrived early most mornings, often before the day shift began, and stayed late into the evening even when he had no scheduled surgeries. The dedication might have been admirable if it weren't so suspicious. On Thursday morning, I watched him enter through the staff entrance at 5:47 a.m., more than 2 hours before his first scheduled procedure. The hospital was mostly empty at that hour. Skeleton crews, sleeping patients, minimal supervision. Perfect conditions for someone with administrative access to help themselves to controlled substances without witnesses. I began photographing his comings and goings, building a timeline that would eventually correlate with medication inventory reports. But photography alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to document what he was actually doing during those early morning visits, needed proof that would hold up in court. That's when I remembered Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer had been a pharmacy tech at the hospital until she'd been laid off 6 months earlier during budget cuts. But she'd always been suspicious about medication discrepancies and had mentioned her concerns to me several times before her termination. More importantly, she still had friends working in the pharmacy who might be willing to share information with someone they trusted. I found Jennifer working at a chain drugstore across town, looking tired but competent behind the prescription counter. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, then darkened when I explained what had happened. She'd suspected something like this might occur, had even predicted that nurses would eventually take the blame for problems that originated much higher up the food chain. Jennifer's information proved invaluable. The pharmacy staff had been documenting irregular access patterns for months, noting how certain doctors seemed to withdraw significantly more controlled substances than their patient loads would justify. They'd reported their concerns to administration multiple times, only to be told that the matter was being handled internally. But Jennifer had kept copies of those reports, along with detailed logs showing which physicians accessed which medications at what times. Dr. Mitchell's name appeared with alarming frequency, especially during off hours when there would be minimal oversight or witnesses. Armed with this new evidence, I returned to Detective Morrison's office with a much stronger case. The combination of pharmacy records, patient complaints, and Mitchell's documented access patterns painted a clear picture of systematic theft. But Morrison wanted more. Ideally, video evidence or direct witness testimony that would make conviction inevitable. That's when I proposed something that made the detective's eyebrows rise: a sting operation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jennifer still had contacts in the hospital pharmacy who could help us document Mitchell's next theft attempt. I would use my knowledge of hospital routines to predict when he'd most likely strike. And Detective Morrison would coordinate with hospital security to ensure the entire incident was captured on surveillance cameras. But timing would be crucial. We'd have only one chance to catch Mitchell in the act before he realized he was being watched. And if we failed, he'd certainly become more careful, possibly relocating his operation or finding new ways to cover his tracks. I spent the next several days analyzing Mitchell's patterns, looking for predictable elements we could exploit. He seemed to prefer early morning access, typically on days when he had afternoon surgeries scheduled. The stolen medications probably helped him maintain his demanding schedule, though some were likely being sold or traded to supplement his income. The pattern suggested he'd most likely strike again early Tuesday morning, before beginning a complex cardiac procedure scheduled for later that day. Jennifer's pharmacy contacts confirmed that controlled substance inventory was typically restocked Monday nights, giving Mitchell fresh opportunities for theft. Monday evening, I positioned myself in the parking garage with a clear view of the staff entrance, while Jennifer coordinated with her contacts inside to ensure the pharmacy surveillance system was functioning properly. Detective Morrison had arranged for additional coverage from hospital security, though they'd been told this was routine fraud prevention rather than a targeted sting. The waiting was excruciating. Every car that entered the garage could have been Mitchell arriving early. Every shadow could have been the beginning of his downfall. But as the hours passed without sign of him, I began to worry that our timing had been wrong, that he'd somehow detected our investigation and altered his routine. Then, at 5:52 a.m., his silver BMW pulled into his reserved parking space. I watched him walk toward the staff entrance with the confident stride of someone who owned the hospital, someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His keycard beeped against the reader, the door clicked open, and he disappeared into the building where he'd been stealing medications while patients suffered in inadequately treated pain. Jennifer's voice came through my earpiece, borrowed from Detective Morrison, confirming that Mitchell had accessed the pharmacy using his administrative codes. The surveillance cameras were recording everything, documenting each step of what we hoped would be his final theft. Minutes crawled by like hours. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. This was it, the moment when justice would finally balance the scales, when the truth would surface despite all the institutional power that had tried to bury it. Morrison's voice crackled through the earpiece. Mitchell had been observed removing controlled substances from the pharmacy inventory and placing them in his personal bag. The theft was documented, recorded, and legally sufficient for arrest and prosecution. But I wanted to watch his face when he realized his world was ending. Security approached Mitchell in the hallway outside the pharmacy, their movement coordinated and professional. I saw him through the glass windows of the hospital lobby, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm to desperate calculation as the situation became clear. There was no bluster, no indignant protests about his reputation or status. Just the sudden stillness of someone who'd been playing a complex game and had finally been checkmated. His shoulders sagged as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and for the first time since I'd known him, Dr. Mitchell looked genuinely vulnerable. Detective Morrison emerged from the hospital with an evidence bag containing the stolen medications, his satisfied expression visible even from across the parking garage. The case that had seemed so complex and untouchable just weeks earlier had suddenly become straightforward. Documented theft, clear motive, indisputable evidence. But my real satisfaction came from knowing that this was just the beginning. The arrest made local news by that afternoon, with reporters describing the shocking downfall of a respected surgeon caught stealing medications intended for cancer patients. The hospital's administration scrambled to contain the damage, issuing carefully worded statements about their commitment to patient safety and their cooperation with law enforcement. What they didn't know was that I'd already provided Detective Morrison with evidence suggesting Mitchell hadn't been operating alone. The scale of the theft, the sophisticated methods used to cover tracks, the administrative protection he'd enjoyed, all of it pointed to a wider network of complicity that reached into the hospital's executive offices. Carson called my cell phone that evening, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of his problems. He wanted to meet, wanted to discuss my potential reinstatement, wanted to explore options for resolving what he characterized as a misunderstanding. I let him leave 3 voicemails before finally responding with a text message. My attorney would be in touch. Because by then, I'd hired Rebecca Martinez, a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases and had a reputation for making institutions pay dearly for retaliating against employees who exposed corruption. Rebecca took one look at my documentation and smiled the kind of smile that usually preceded very expensive settlements. The wrongful termination lawsuit we filed painted a detailed picture of the hospital's negligence, corruption, and systematic retaliation against anyone who tried to expose the truth. But more importantly, it kept the story in the news, ensuring that public attention remained focused on the institution that had chosen to protect a thief rather than their patients. Mitchell's criminal trial began 3 months later, and I attended every day of proceedings. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, built on the evidence we'd gathered and supplemented by additional investigators who'd uncovered years of systematic theft. Patient after patient testified about inadequate pain management, while their families described watching loved ones suffer unnecessarily. The defense tried to portray Mitchell as a dedicated physician who'd made some poor personal choices but remained committed to patient care. But the mathematics were unforgiving. Hundreds of doses stolen, thousands of dollars in street value, dozens of patients who'd received substandard treatment while their prescribed medications were diverted for profit. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Mitchell received a 12-year sentence, loss of his medical license, and substantial financial penalties that would ensure he'd never practice medicine again. But the criminal conviction was only the first domino to fall. The civil lawsuits began within weeks, filed by patients and families who'd suffered because of Mitchell's theft. Each case generated additional media coverage, additional scrutiny of the hospital's oversight failures, additional pressure on administrators who'd enabled the corruption through willful blindness. Carson resigned quietly, accepting a settlement that included non-disclosure agreements, but also prevented him from working in healthcare administration again. Several other executives followed, their departures accompanied by carefully worded press releases about pursuing new opportunities. The hospital ultimately paid out more than $8 million in settlements and legal fees, while implementing new oversight systems that would make future medication theft much more difficult. They also established a fund for patients who'd been affected by inadequate pain management, though no amount of money could truly compensate for suffering that could have been prevented. My own settlement was substantial enough to ensure I'd never have to worry about finding another nursing job, though I'd already decided to pursue a different path. Rebecca introduced me to other attorneys who specialized in healthcare fraud, and I discovered that my combination of medical knowledge and investigative skills made me valuable as a consultant. I now spend my time helping other healthcare workers who've been retaliated against for reporting corruption, and assisting prosecutors who need someone who understands how hospitals really operate. It's more satisfying than I'd expected, using everything I learned during 15 years of nursing to ensure that patients receive the care they deserve rather than the care that's most profitable. Sometimes I drive past the hospital where I used to work, noting the changes that have been implemented since Mitchell's conviction. New security systems, revised medication protocols, additional oversight positions. All improvements that could have been made years earlier if administrators had cared more about patient welfare than protecting their star surgeon. Mrs. Rodriguez recovered well from her cancer treatment once she began receiving adequate pain management. Her grandson Tommy still works hospital security, though he's been promoted to a supervisory position with responsibility for investigating internal complaints. He waves when he sees me, and I can tell he remembers the night he escorted me to my car, when neither of us knew we were witnessing the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Jennifer Walsh completed her pharmacy degree and now works as a clinical pharmacist, specializing in pain management protocols that ensure patients receive the medications they need. She keeps a photo on her desk from the day Mitchell was sentenced, not out of vindictiveness, but as a reminder that sometimes the system does work when people are willing to fight for what's right. Detective Morrison retired 6 months after Mitchell's conviction, but not before receiving a commendation for his work on the case. He told me at his retirement party that healthcare fraud cases were among the most satisfying he'd ever worked, because the victims were often the most vulnerable members of society, and the perpetrators were people who'd sworn oaths to do no harm. As for me, I wake up each morning knowing that I helped ensure justice was served, that patients are safer because someone was willing to stand up to institutional power and demand accountability. The satisfaction is different from what I felt as a nurse, less immediate but more profound, the knowledge that sometimes the arc of justice really does bend toward what's right. I was a nurse they blamed for missing meds, but in the end I proved that the truth has a way of surfacing despite every effort to bury it. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people who try to destroy you end up providing you with the motivation and freedom necessary to destroy them instead. The scales balanced themselves, as they always do when someone refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. And in that balance, I found something more valuable than any career: the certainty that I'd fought back when it mattered most, and won